So we've talked about Grimnir, the ancestor god of warfare, and his mighty kind of offensives against the chaos legions of the Great Catastrophe. But there's a name that many of the dwarfs shout as a war chant, and some of the most important figureheads in the dwarf society pay special homage to her, and that is Valaya, the dwarf goddess of hearth and healing. So Valaya is very integral to the growth of the dwarfs, and in a lot of ways, what makes them unique, what makes the dwarfs overly unique, especially from a magical standpoint. She is the twin wife of both Grimnir and Grungi. We've talked about this before, but this would make for a lot of weird conversations in my mind. But dwarfs will be dwarfs, where Grungi tended to the kind of stone and the delving and the mountains. He taught the dwarves to delve deep into the mountains, and Grimnir perfected the art of war for the dwarves. Valaya had a very much of a different role. She's kind of portrayed in this sort of stereotypical female Norse shield maiden with a long braided hair down to her feet and a suit of chainmail atop this purple tunic. I think Lagatha from the show Vikings on History Channel, only less Canadian, way less hot, and way more dwarf, obviously. But you guys can really decide if that facial hair down to the ground means if that hair down to the ground means facial hair or hair. But that's up to you. But she carries her mighty rune axe, peace giver, and so again, this very portrait of a shield maiden, and she is the patron god of hearth, home, healing, brewing, holds, all these things, all this culture of the dwarves. And I can't think of another H word that she is in charge of, but I'm sure it's out there. And a center point of dwarf society is their beloved ale from Bugman's Brew down to this watered down slop that they'd give to humans because humans can't stomach anything other than watered down slop. But if you really kind of look at it this way, dwarfs are known for their drinking ability. And a lot of that is owed to Valaya. And on top of this, she gave the grand gift of holds to the dwarfs. If Grungi taught dwarfs how to delve into the mountains, Valaya taught them how to make homes out of that delving. And she is responsible for the establishment of both Karak Eight Peaks and Karaz Akarak. And that's actually her holy city. It's kind of dedicated to her, more or less. And the Karaz Akarak, it houses the largest shrine to her in all of the Karaz-Ankor. And these massive shrines are located throughout every hold, every house, even all the breweries. And that makes a lot of sense, patron goddess of brewing. God. But the kind of the greatest gift that Valaya really bestows upon dwarfdom is the gift of runesmithing, and she taught the very first rune priests how to inscribe these powerful runes onto both armor and weapons, giving them powers to both protect and deliver even more destruction. And runesmithing, by and far, is one of the biggest traits of not just the dwarf society, but their armies as a whole. I mean, you've got you've got Gromril armor, which is etched with runes and enchantments, and a lot of if you kind of recall back from the High Elf lore of the early kind of alliance between High Elves and Dwarfs, we know that the High Elves taught Dwarves quote unquote enchantments, and I don't know what that really means, to be totally honest with you guys. It's in the books that it says this. I don't know if that means they taught them how to strengthen the rune inscriptions on all of their armor and all of their weaponry, or if it means something a little bit different. Because we already know that elves are doing this. The priests of Vol are doing this out of Vol's anvil. They're creating all of this, not necessarily runish, but these enchanted weapons and armor. So I'm not sure if this kind of plays a hand in the level of complexity of the runesmiths making all their weapons and armor. And dwarves even offer rune inscribed weaponry to other races as these kind of gifts or tokens of gratitude. Volton's armor is rune etched by some of the best rune priests of the age. It depends on which Volton you want to look at, Storm of Chaos or End Times, but that's neither here nor there. All 12 of the rune fangs of the Empire, the original 12 rune fangs, were created by the great runesmith Alaric the Mad. So this magic equipment of the dwarf stands out amongst some of the finest tools of war in the Warhammer world. And it's said that Grungy foresaw the coming of chaos, and Valaya was able to create a rune that would protect the dwarves in their underground holds, protecting and shielding them from the fell magic of the warp. And we've talked about the Great Catastrophe and how the dwarves had to retreat to their holds as a last bastion against this constant threat, this constant incursion of demons. And a lot of this information comes from the second edition of the Warhammer Fantasy RPG book. And so it's important to note that the Dwarf Army book kind of touches on Valaya, and it kind of touches on Grungy, and kind of touches on Grimnir, but less so of Valaya than the other two. Valaya is accredited with a lot of these great things, but not really given a lot of credit. Like, it's just, oh yeah, Valaya does all these great things, creates these holds, creates this rune magic, but the rune magic that pertains to war, Grimnir's got a lot of hand in that. So there's a lot of weird undertakings with Valaya, and we'll get a little bit more into that in a second here. But in the second edition of Warhammer Fantasy RPG are what they call Strictures, or really just kind of the requirements of any follower of Valaya. And I'd really like to go over these with you guys because they kind of embody the passion and humility of Valaya. Valaya kind of has this duality and she usually typically has two statues in all of her shrines, one being that of her as a kindly motherly figure, the other being her and her war regalia that we went through a second ago with the chainmail, the kind of shield maiden look. But here's kind of the tenets, I guess you could say, of Balaiah. Always provide aid to a wounded or ailing dwarf. Always assist a dwarf friend in need. Again, that means anyone who is a friend of the dwarfs. Always attend to the needs of the young. Always protect fellow dwarfs from harm, especially at the hands of a dwarf enemy. Never allow a dwarf ale to fall in the hands of enemies, unless to do so saves dwarf lives. Never knowingly sell or otherwise distribute spoiled ale. So definitely the patron god of brewing. But the Kara's Angkor owes its culture as a whole, even their written language, to Valaya, the ancestor goddess. And as with Grungy, or Grungy, Valaya sort of disappears from the world of dwarfs suddenly and disappears into the mountains with that sort of always famous anecdote that we see in Warhammer and in Warhammer 40,000 of coming back when the time is needed most, right? Like, oh, we need her. Where the hell is she? But it kind of gets down to what really happens to Valaya during the end times. That's always the kicker, right? We know that Gotrek rises up to become the new incarnate of Grimnir, and we know that Grungy is a part of the actual kind of final battle. Him and Grimnir kind of ally up with the rest of the dwarfs to fight and settle all grudges. That's kind of this big sweeping ending moment of dwarfdom in the Warhammer Fantasy world before Age of Sigmar kicks off. But what of Valaya? You know, the sweet ancestor goddess of the dwarfs. Well, we don't really know what happens to her. I mean, as in, is she dead? Is she alive? Does she have a different embodiment? What kind of goes down? That's not overly been divulged just yet. But what we do know is that Nagash drains all of her magic from her. And after Neferata kind of sieges the great gates and bursts them open, he says, hey, Nagash, here, make me one of your Mortarks, but suckle the teat of Valaya in there. And he drains her again of all of her magic. And it's important to note, though, he did not kill her. He simply just drains her of her magic. Does it drain her of her divinity? I'm not sure. Nagash doesn't ascend to godhood until he kills Usirian, the Kemrian, or the Tomb King god of death. But in the Age of Sigmar, we see Grungy and we see Grimnir back in full force, you know, with these kind of fleeting mentions of Valaya. So we know she's at least alive. You know, we've got Grimnir leading his whole, I think it's like the Firebeards or Firebrand or something like that. We've got Grungy leading the whole new line of dwarves that just came out, all like the steampunk looking dwarves. But there is the Dwarden. And these are the female dwarves. So maybe we're going to see a whole race of female dwarfs kind of come to the equation as an Age of Sigmar possible army to have. And maybe we'll see just a unified dwarf faction or something kind of come out from this. But for now, Valaya is very much a missing in action in the current timeline. But we'll again see how that progresses as Age of Sigmar progresses. But that really kind of rounds off here our tale of Valaya, there's not a whole ton to go off of. In fact, I'd say Grimnir has got the most to go off of, even though Grungi is probably the most important dwarf ancestor god. Grimnir definitely has the most history because his kind of his hand in the dwarf history is a lot more, I don't want to say recent, but it's definitely a lot more heavy-handed, right? You've got this guy who's leading these charges against all these demons and killing them off a ton at a time, and eventually at the end times, incarnate, or it becomes Gotrek becomes his avatar, his incarnate. So there's a lot going on with Grimnir by comparison to Balaiah and Grungi, but there's still plenty to go over with Grungi, and he will be our last dwarf ancestor god as we round out the dwarf quote-unquote pantheon. There are more ancestor gods, but they were more talked about in the second edition Warhammer Fantasy RPG, and I'm more than willing to go over them because I feel like they're definitely important. But if we're talking about strictly from the Warhammer army book, it's definitely relegated down to these three with scant mentions of the others. So I can definitely go into them if you guys would like to hear about them. I can maybe even just do one video where I go through all of them real quick. But again, guys, here's Valaya, our second to last ancestor goddess. We'll jump into Grungi in our next video on the ancestor gods. But thanks for watching here today, guys. Have a good one and take care.